My dad traded me for drug money, then he needed a kidney, and I was his only match. I was 11 the day my father traded me. I remember the kitchen smelled of stale beer and something metallic I couldn't name. Empty cans scattered across the table, and he looked at me, not with love, not with care, but with a weightless detachment I wouldn't understand until years later. "Pack your things," he said. "You're going to live with Ray for a while." I didn't know what "a while" meant. I didn't know it meant months, almost a year of my life stolen, sold for $3,000 of unpaid debt. Ray was his dealer, a man whose hands trembled constantly, whose teeth were yellowed from years of neglect. I had seen him twice before, just fleeting moments where I waited in a car while they exchanged things I didn't understand. I would have preferred to wait in the car forever. Anything would have been better than living in that house. The day I left, I felt invisible, though my father's eyes carried the kind of guilt that no apology could erase. I clutched a small backpack of clothes, my notebook, the only thing I felt I owned, and followed him to the car. The ride was quiet, filled only with the hum of the engine and my own thoughts. I wondered if he had once loved me. I wondered if he ever would again. Ray's house smelled like decay and chemicals, a place where sunlight barely reached and every surface held a shadow of neglect. The windows were covered in foil and trash bags, filtering what little warmth could enter. Inside, 3 men watched me with indifference, their presence like a constant pressure in the air. Ray led me to the basement, a small room with a mattress on the floor, locked from the outside. "This is yours," he said. "You clean, cook, and keep quiet. You're useful. You cause problems. You don't eat." I nodded. I learned quickly that speaking made the world worse, that asking questions only drew attention. I lay on the mattress that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember my mother's face. She had died when I was 6, lost to the same addiction that now consumed my father. The memories were fading, slipping like sand through my fingers, leaving only the faintest impression of love and warmth. The first morning brought work, dishes caked with mold, surfaces coated with grime, a living room scorched by cigarette burns. I scrubbed for hours before Ray came to inspect. He nodded once, threw me a granola bar, and returned upstairs. Days blurred into one another. I woke when the house moved, cleaned after the mess, and slept when the basement allowed. I walked to school in the mornings under Ray's watch, told teachers I lived with an uncle, and kept my silence. I started to observe the house like it was a game. Floorboards creaking under certain weight, schedules memorized, movements mapped. Some of Ray's friends made my stomach tighten, their glances lingering too long, their laughter a sharp knife I couldn't dodge. Vincent was one of them. I learned to block my door with a broken dresser, buying seconds to wake, seconds I desperately needed. 3 months in, my father appeared, thinner, hollow-eyed, sores marking his skin, his hand trembling as he handed Ray $200, all he could afford. Ray counted and shook his head. $800 still owed. My father looked at me, a stranger in his own child's skin, then left without a word. I returned to the basement and cried for the first time since arriving. 8 months passed. I learned to cook from scraps, to manage the house, to survive in silence. I learned that adults could hurt without warning or watch while you struggled, their apathy sharp enough to cut. I learned patience, endurance, invisibility, and still, each day carried the unspoken weight of betrayal, the debt my father had traded me for. One Saturday in March, the breaking point came. Ray's party filled the house with chaos, the basement walls echoing with distant noise. I stayed pressed against the mattress, the dresser against the door, my heart pounding in rhythm with the stomping from above. Vincent's voice slurred, words I didn't understand, but felt in every nerve of my body. The fear that had been a quiet companion became a roaring presence. It was then I realized the depth of the world I had been thrust into. I was no longer the child who waited in cars. I was a survivor, molded by neglect and necessity. And yet, even in survival, I was only a shadow of myself, a version of a boy stolen by the one who should have protected me. I remember that night clearly, the way the basement smelled of damp and fear, the mattress pressed against my body, and the quiet that followed the chaos. It was in that silence that I made a promise to myself. Not to my father, not to Ray, but to me. That I would endure, that I would live, even if the cost was a childhood I could never reclaim. The months stretched on, each day a careful balance between silence and survival. I learned the rhythm of the house, memorizing the creaks and groans of the floors, the patterns of footsteps above me, The moments when Ray would emerge from his room and when his friends would roam the halls. Every movement, every sound became a part of a map I carried in my mind. This map was my only protection, my only way to feel that, in some small measure, I could control something in a life that had been stolen from me. School became my only escape, a place where the walls were not covered in foil and the air did not carry the stench of neglect. I told my teachers I lived with my uncle, and they never asked more than a passing question. I learned quickly how to smile just enough to appear normal, how to speak just enough to avoid attention, how to vanish into the background of the classroom. My grades were steady, my presence was quiet. I became a ghost among students who laughed, who fought, who lived without the shadows that followed me like a second skin. At Ray's, life was a different kind of struggle. I cooked meals from scraps, learning the taste and texture of survival. Sometimes the food was barely enough to fill me, but I learned to eat slowly, carefully, as if stretching the act itself could keep me alive a little longer. I scrubbed dishes with grime that would not come off, cleaned floors that had never known polish, and washed clothes that carried the smell of neglect like a second skin. Ray offered little praise, a nod, a granola bar, a glance that could be interpreted as satisfaction or indifference. I accepted it all, knowing that complaint or question might turn a day into a nightmare. Vincent continued to watch me. He never spoke to me directly except in passing remarks, but his eyes followed me. They were a reminder of the constant vigilance I needed to maintain. I learned to calculate my movements, to anticipate his presence, to avoid him without making him suspicious. The broken dresser in my basement room became a shield. It would not stop him completely, but it would buy me seconds that could make the difference between noticing danger and being caught unaware. 8 months became a year. Time passed with a strange elasticity. Days stretched long, and nights felt like minutes. My father appeared occasionally, thinner, more hollow, carrying the marks of addiction on his skin and in his eyes. He brought small sums of money, not enough to settle the debt, always leaving before I could speak. Each time I felt a mixture of longing and anger. I wanted to ask him why, to demand an explanation, but I knew from experience that questions were dangerous. I swallowed my words, hiding my feelings behind a mask of compliance and quiet. I began to write in my notebook every night. The words became my lifeline, a way to preserve my identity in a world that was intent on erasing it. I wrote about the small victories, the days I managed to cook a meal without complaint, the moments I walked to school without incident, the nights I slept without being disturbed. I wrote about my fear, about the anger that simmered under the surface, about the longing for a family that existed only in memory. My notebook became a sanctuary, a place where my thoughts were my own, and where my father could not take anything from me. As I grew, I began to notice subtle changes in myself. My body, once small and fragile, became stronger. My mind, sharpened by constant observation and necessity, became strategic. I learned to anticipate behavior, to read intentions, to protect myself with nothing more than attention and awareness. I became independent in a way that children rarely are, forced to grow faster than anyone should. And yet, beneath the strength, beneath the careful planning, there remained a child who longed for safety, for care, for the warmth of a home that had been promised and stolen. Then, one afternoon, the inevitable happened. My father appeared at the door, thinner and paler than I remembered, eyes sunken, voice trembling. Ray allowed him in, and he looked at me across the table, not as a father, not as a man who had failed, but as a man in need. I did not move. I did not speak. I understood before he said anything that he had come for help, not for reunion. His debt had not been repaid, and his life had become dependent on mine in a way I never imagined. The years between then and the moment he asked me to save him had passed like shadows through a house I could never fully call mine. I had grown accustomed to silence, to endurance, to survival. I had built walls around my emotions, hiding the hurt, the anger, the longing. And yet in that room, looking at my father with eyes that had once looked at me with love and disappointment, I felt the first tremor of a choice I could not avoid. I learned then the cruel arithmetic of our lives, debts unpaid in youth return with interest in adulthood. The child who had been traded for money became the only person capable of saving the man who had betrayed him. I felt the weight of history, the cold knowledge that survival had a cost, and that cost was now being placed in my hands. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and fear. Machines hummed quietly, monitoring a life that had once belonged fully to him, now dependent on the generosity of the child he had forsaken. I sat by his bed, the sterile sheets cold beneath my fingers, and I remembered the basement, the dirt and grime, the nights spent counting the hours until dawn. I remembered Ray's house, the broken furniture, the shadows that taught me vigilance, and the father who had looked away while my childhood was taken. He spoke my name, weak, frail, a shadow of the man who had once been my protector. I did not answer. I did not move. I understood the stakes, the impossible choice before me. I realized then that morality was no longer simple, that survival and justice were intertwined in ways that could not be separated. The doctors explained the procedure, the risks, the logistics. I listened, silent, absorbing the words without comment. Each syllable carried with it the weight of my own history, the echoes of neglect and abandonment, and the knowledge that my actions now would determine not only his survival, but the legacy of a childhood stolen, a debt repaid in ways no one could have anticipated. I looked at him, this man who had failed me so utterly, and I felt the full force of betrayal and necessity. The past and present collided in that room, leaving only a narrow path forward. I could save him, I could watch him die. There were no simple answers, no absolution, no reprieve from the truth of what had been done. I chose neither lightly nor easily. Every second in that sterile room felt measured, deliberate. I remembered the basement, the floorboards, the schedule of movement, the small victories that had sustained me. I drew strength from survival, from the knowledge that I had endured everything life had thrown at me. And I realized as I sat there that endurance did not require forgiveness, nor did it demand surrender. Endurance required action, even when the heart was broken, even when the choice carried the weight of betrayal. I watched the machines, the monitors, the slow rhythmic pulse of life hanging in the balance. And I felt, more acutely than I ever had, the fragility of existence, the cruelty of chance, and the impossible demand of a father who had once traded me for money. The story of my life, my survival, and the debt of my father converged in that hospital room, and I understood the full measure of what it meant to endure. The hospital room was silent in a way that pressed against my chest. Machines hummed quietly, recording every heartbeat, every breath, a rhythm that marked the fragility of a life that had once been careless with my own. My father lay there, a shadow of the man who had abandoned me, his eyes half-lidded, sunken, pleading. He was entirely dependent on me now, the child he had traded for money holding the only key to his survival. I sat beside him, tracing the memories of the basement, the grime, the nights of silent fear, the stolen childhood that had forced me to grow faster than anyone should. Each image was sharp, unyielding, etched into the fabric of who I had become. And now, those years of survival, strategy, and vigilance culminated in a choice I could not ignore. The doctor spoke again, detailing the risks, the procedure, the consequences. Each word fell like stones into my chest, heavy and inescapable. I did not flinch. I had learned to endure pain, disappointment, and betrayal. I had learned to survive the impossible. And now, survival demanded action not for myself, but for the man who had once sold me as if I were currency. I looked at him, at the face I barely recognized. This was the man who had failed me, the man who had let my mother die, the man who had chosen his addiction over his child. And yet, here he was, clinging to life with nothing but my body as his chance. I felt a storm of anger, sorrow, and disbelief. I could feel the years pressing into me, the injustice of a life stolen, the weight of a choice no child should ever face. Time seemed suspended. Every second stretched, each breath a reminder of the debt, both literal and moral, that existed between us. I thought of the basement, of Ray's house, of the countless nights I had counted my own worth in chores and survival. I thought of school, of the small victories, of the notebook that had preserved my voice when no one else cared to listen. And I realized with a painful clarity that the only power I had ever truly owned was my own choice. The procedure was scheduled. I signed the forms, my hand steady despite the tremor in my chest. The doctors prepared us, spoke in clinical tones that could not reach the emotional weight in the room. And then, in a quiet, unspoken moment, I watched the life I could give him, the very life he had once overlooked, become the possibility of his continued existence. The surgery was inevitable, precise, and yet utterly final. I followed the instructions, the protocols, the steps that ensured he might live. And in the cold, antiseptic light of the hospital, I understood the tragic irony. The father who had once traded me for money was now saved by the very child he had abandoned. When the procedure was over, I stood outside the recovery room. Nurses moved efficiently, machines hummed, and the air smelled of antiseptic and something faintly metallic. I did not enter. I could not. I had given him the chance to live, but the past remained indelible, unchangeable. The debt was paid in a way, but the loss, the years of my childhood, the betrayal, the absence of love, remained. He would survive, but nothing would be restored. The life I had been forced to endure had created a person who could act, who could endure, but who could not forget. I left the hospital room, my steps heavy with the knowledge that survival does not erase memory, and that forgiveness is a choice separate from mercy. And in that moment, I realized something essential. The strength I had cultivated, the resilience that had carried me through the darkness of Ray's house, and the neglect of a father addicted, was mine alone. It was not for him. It was not for the world. It was for me. Life continued, quiet, unrelenting. I walked through the streets with a clarity born of survival, with an understanding that the past shapes the present, but does not dictate every choice. And though the father I had known would live, the child who had been traded would never return. That boy existed only in memory, in the basement, in the quiet notebook that had preserved his voice. And as I moved forward, I carried both the weight of betrayal and the knowledge of my own endurance. The past could not be undone, but I could choose how I faced the future. I could live, fully and deliberately, even when the world had been unfair, even when the father who had failed me lingered alive, dependent on my mercy. Some debts are repaid in ways that cannot heal wounds, and some choices leave no comfort. But survival is never a question of comfort. It is a question of endurance, of witnessing life's cruelty and stepping forward anyway, of claiming one's own power after a childhood stolen. And so I walked forward, silent, unbroken, aware that the life I had been forced to live had forged me into someone who could endure anything. Thank you for listening to Tale Hub. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that linger long after they're told.